Okay, so continuing on, we have a little interaction, even though you're out there in the virtual world and I can't see any of your faces. But I do want to learn a little bit more about you and allow you to learn a little bit more about each other. So we have this Menti survey in real time. So if you go to the instructions here, go to menti.com, enter this code you see, or use the QR code, and we'll be able to take some real-time surveys. Looks like 10 of you have found your way. Be a little more time. Great. All right. As you get there, let's start with this question. What motivated you to attend this workshop? Firm owner, emerging leader, just interested in leadership development, all of the above. All right. Well, it looks like we have some people who are both firm owners and emerging leaders, which is great because there are many firms we work with people in that very position, learning on the job, learning as you become an owner and a leader, learning hopefully from the people that you're working with. We have a few more minutes, seconds. Okay, let's go to the next question. How big is your firm? All right. So it looks like the majority of the firms are between 5 and 10, and that's interesting. It's a size that has a lot of potential, also some challenges. So interesting group, one firm over 50, and then also some between 20 and 50. So good diversity in terms of size. Okay. Is your firm financially healthy? Do you have a sense it's doing okay? Do you know? All right, most of you have answered this quite quickly. And looks like most of you are doing well. I know the East Coast seems to be a little bit healthier, especially the Northeast right now than what we're seeing on the West Coast. It's a lot of uncertainty there. But good to see that so many of you feel like you're doing well financially in your practices these days. So the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of shifting around, a lot of change because of remote work and hybrid work. How is it affecting your your firms? Hmm. Interesting, almost half and a half between back fully to the office and having hybrid work. It's an issue that's very up, and I think it's really important in operations and in leadership transition as well, because leaders there. I've been working with firms now more and more where some of the new leaders and some of the successors are working remote. Maybe you don't even live in the same town as the firm. So, the world is changing in relation to this. All right. Well, let's get into the heart of this and the life cycle of a typical firm. We see that most firms have a difficult time breaking out of the um, basically domination of a single owner or single two owners to actually be able to create value in their firm beyond the individual. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, having a very small firm and having control of everything and having your name on the door and developing your firm that way is a bad idea. A lot of people have really successful, wonderful careers and great retirements that way. But it does propose some limitations. It does make it less likely that you can earn money from your firm itself as you retire. So the alternative to this is to develop second generation leadership, to create a firm that has value beyond the principals, beyond the founders. It might include a rebrand, it might not, but it is dependent on developing new leadership and empowering others to take control, to take leadership, to take authority and responsibility within your firm. How comfortable you are doing that, varies, and nobody should share power or share control if they're not comfortable with it. But comfort level with that and trusting the really smart and capable people you hire is really key to that. So we do have challenges to being able to develop new leadership, to transition firms from perhaps baby boomer founders to the next generation. And part of it is just demographics, that the workforce numbers are very small for Gen X, at 33% now, and pretty much for the entire work life of the Gen X generation. They're a very small generation, half the size of the baby boomers, half the size of the millennials. And in architecture, we lost many of the Gen X generation in the Great Recession, who were just graduating from school and didn't have any opportunities, left the profession. So now it's extremely hard to find people who have 15, 20 years experience or to be in a position to really pass your firm on to. Millennials, however, are a large generation, and their percentage of the workforce is only going to increase over the next 10 to 20 years. And we find that, often in ownership transition, we have to look towards the millennial generation to as emerging leaders to really begin to be the ones who can take over our firms. And of course, Gen Z will be becoming more and more a part of our firms over the next decade or two. But these generations have different feelings about entrepreneurship and the idea of running a business in the first place. And there's typically the sort of stereotype is there's a bit of risk aversion among Gen Xers. There's unrealistic financial expectations among millennials. The Gen Zs are usually not really old enough yet to assume leadership, and of course the boomers are now beginning to retire and leave the profession in various ways. But there's other macro challenges that we face as we're looking for a successor to take over our firms. And, there's a conversation to be had about the price of the firm. What is a firm actually worth? What's its value? And if you have a very successful firm and you've been quite profitable and you have a high firm value, you may have a big problem with affordability. The people who are your successors may just not be able to pay the price that you think the firm is worth, or the market might say it is if it were acquired. So that can be a challenge. On the other side, if your firm is low in profitability, it doesn't have as much firm value. And why should someone want to invest and think that they could turn this around and make it a profitable company? Lack of firm value because of singular control, as I was mentioning before. If everything is coming to you and your name is completely associated with all the work that's done, which was the case when I tried to sell my firm, which it basically has no value without you. I was told, oh yeah, we'll buy your firm if you work for us for another 5 years, which wasn't in the deal here for me. But it's important to consider that and to consider how these choices will affect that. And then, of course, lack of planning is the biggest challenge that we see. You really need 10 years, at least 5, to have an effective leadership transition. The ownership transition can take a long time. The financial exchange can go over many years, but if you're really wanting to retire within a reasonable period of time, then you've got to start planning sooner rather than later. One of the real challenges that founders deal with, when I'm talking about, oh, just let go of control, it's easy. No, we know it's not easy, and it's difficult to trust and to feel like people you're employing, are really going to be as committed as you are as a firm owner. And there's been some studies done about this, talking about how entrepreneurs who want to be kings of their little nation or kingdom, or queens of their queendom, it's totally fine, but they're less likely to make a lot of money, increase the value of their firm, than someone who has an ability to let go and bring other people in to empowerment in their firm. So it's kind of like, do you want to be king or do you want to be rich? It's that kind of choice, and either is okay, but you should do it consciously, right? And part of that conscious decision is really understanding where you are as a leader. And this is important for those of you who are emerging professionals, emerging leaders who are becoming owners now, to really understand what your leadership style is. Do you like to get input and then make the decisions on your own? Do you want to make all the decisions, or are you really comfortable with empowering others to make a lot of decisions and have good authority? So understanding that helps you structure a firm and structure an ownership transition plan that will actually work for you. And if you can, structure a plan or think about how you want to share leadership or not, you have more or fewer choices when you do go towards retirement. And we are going to talk about various choices here, merging with a younger firm. I'm going to give you a couple of case studies about that, because that seems to be a really viable solution for firm leaders who haven't developed successors. But if you have developed a successor, internal transition, and those who purchase a firm from internally can really leverage the knowledge and the client base and all the intellectual property that resides in that firm, which includes the legacy of the founders. So these are kind of your, kind of a summary of the choices that you have, depending on how many years you have, whether you have an internal successor or not. If you have 5 to 10 years and you have an internal successor, you can really create a successful ownership transition expansion plan where you have enough time together to really transition knowledge and client and business development activities. If you have no successor, you may even have time to hire one, or as I mentioned before, merge with another firm. If you have a shorter time frame, 2 to 5 years, and you have no successor, you may want to think about closing your firm, which isn't always a bad option. I mean, there are other ways that you can preserve your legacy besides the firm. So it's important to think about that option, especially if you have quite a small firm and it's been quite profitable. Without transitioning ownership, you would just keep all the profits in the years until you decide you don't want to work anymore and close it down. Of course, is a process, but it is an option that should be talked about. And then there is the option of being acquired, which you might want to consider at any point, but usually they're more interested, the firms that are acquiring other firms are more interested in them if you're in a niche market or you're in a particular location where this other firm wants to be. There's pros and cons to being acquired, and we'll be talking about that as well. So here's kind of the step-by-step for firm closure. And as I said, it's something that's certainly worth considering, especially if you have a relatively short time frame, especially if your firm has been profitable. You can finish up your work, just take fewer projects, work for your most favorite clients, just kind of create the firm you want as you downsize it. Sometimes you have to give incentives for key people to stay with you for a while, but it is an option that is worth considering, and not a bad one in many cases. So this is really a summary of the kinds of things that contribute to having a successful ownership transition. That first of all, you create a strong firm that's financially healthy, that has market value as a business entity, and you start thinking about it far enough in advance of your retirement that you can really make a plan. And I think maybe it's easier to make a plan when you're 10 years from retirement than it is when you're 3 years away, because often people who are 3 years away are like, I don't really want to retire. I'll never retire. I don't really want to face this, but maybe 10 years away, it doesn't seem so real, so you can make a plan. But it's important to plan. And I think that, as architects and designers, we're trained in planning. We just have to apply that same kind of design thinking to how we want to visualize our preferred future. So here's our first CE word, demographics. I think you're supposed to make a note of that. So please do. And even though I don't have this, let me take a moment for questions. Are there any questions? Is there a question in the chat room?
Yeah, we had one question from Jacqueline asking, curious if the workforce generation statistics were US as a whole or specific to the architecture field.
Oh, it was US as a whole. So the architecture field is I would say typical, similar to what we see. I don't have demographics at the tip of my fingers, but from what I've seen, we're pretty much the same as most other um, workforces.
That was the only question I'm seeing right
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go on. So let's talk about the mechanics a little bit of ownership transition and of running a firm in general. And I'm going to come back to this slide a few times during this presentation and thank my colleague Michael Strogoff for allowing me to use this. But this understanding that there's really three important aspects here: ownership, governance, and leadership. So, we're going to talk about ownership at first here, how you transition it. There are many different aspects to it, including the tax implications and the legal agreements and the general succession planning. And there's also owner concern about the cash flow and how the business is running financially. But there's also governance, which is not necessarily the same thing as ownership. In some organizations, there's a board of directors, people who don't own the firm that are also involved in governance, or there might be shareholders that aren't materially involved in the company that are involved in governance. In most architectural firms, that's not so much the case, but you still need to understand what the bylaws of your organization is and how you're going to make decisions with the other shareholders, especially as you begin to bring new ones into the fold. And then there's leadership, which has to do with project leadership and firm leadership and leadership in the community, being able to leverage that towards business development. And there are many firms where there are firm leaders who are not owners. And sometimes it's the distinction between using the nomenclature of partners for owners and principals for non-equity leaders of the firm. So it's important to remember that ownership isn't the only reward that you can give your longtime employees. There's other kinds of incentive profit sharing programs. Sometimes it's just a title principle that makes a difference. But, sometimes that is a challenging issue itself when you have more than one potential successors and you really are only interested in one and not the other. So sometimes that can be a little bit tricky. So looking at the ownership part, I'm going to start by talking about valuation methodologies. And the first concept that I think is important to understand is book value. It's thrown around a lot. Sometimes I'll see ownership transition plans where the valuation is based on book value, which really is the firm's equity. And in most architectural firms, there isn't a lot of long-term debt. So assets are the major part of the firm's equity or book value. It's like the tangible value of the firm without anything for goodwill or reputation or client base or those kinds of intangible things. So it includes cash, it includes accounts receivable, it includes your furniture, all computers, all those kinds of things, and basically represents what the value of the firm would be if you liquidated it. So if you sold everything you own, collect everything that is owed to you, pay back all your debts, what do you have left? Now, book value is also very changeable. I mean, basically it changes every day with your cash or accounts receivable. So it's, in some ways it's highly manipulatable because it could include, cash that you put in or take out. I I don't really recommend it as the basis for valuation, except perhaps for partners who are splitting and, they're splitting the, tangible value of the firm and going their own way. Nevertheless, there are formulas based on book value that have been around for decades. 1.5 times book value for internal sale and 2.2 times book value for external sale. And it's based on what's in the balance sheet as of a certain date. And this could be a starting point. The 0.5 in an internal sale represents the value of reputation, the non-tangible assets, and for external sale, that's a very important part of what you're selling, and you should definitely start with a higher price for an external sale negotiation. The Zweig Group, which is a consulting and research group in our industry, publishes a number of different reports, and one of them is a valuation report every year, and it's filled with about 200 or more different formulas based on the situation and what different factors you want to include. For internal sale, they recommend this formula, which has 6 factors so it includes number of employees, revenue, backlog, work you have under contract but haven't done yet. EBITDA, which is basically your profit before taxes and any distribution, and then your actual profit after taxes and distribution, with book value and debt factored in as well. And so you get a number that is a good working valuation, a starting point in internal valuation negotiations. But I feel that these kinds of formulas to use for a working valuation is really the start of a conversation in internal valuations, because you're bounded by what your buyers can afford to, and so the deal, your price, and how it ends is to some extent based on that, although there's always price plus terms that would be part of this negotiation. So this is another formula. This is a formula just based on revenue, because there are many firms that show no profit on their financial reports, and that could be for a number of reasons. It could be that the owner just takes all the distributions that come out of the firm and leaves nothing in there, or they, rather than be salaried, they take everything that's left, after revenue minus operational expenses. But or there could be other reasons, like a firm is simply not profitable after paying everybody and all of their expenses. So if a firm isn't profitable but operates on revenue, and a lot of firms do this, it's just, the next job is paying for the current job, and everybody can get market rate salaries and do fine, and the firm goes on year after year, but it really doesn't, show anything at the bottom line. So if that's the case, Zweig provides a formula that's based on gross revenue. Now, as I was saying, these especially these formulaic valuations are just a starting point for negotiations when you're working out a deal about the price. And I want to, state that there's a difference between these formulaic valuations and what we would call a comprehensive valuation, because these formulaic valuations are really just based on a moment in time. Whereas the comprehensive valuations will look back over, 4 or 5 years, use weighted averages. Many people who do this apply proprietary formulas to do it. It's, a lengthy and somewhat costly process, but accountants do it. They're certified business valuators, and there are people within our industry who do it frequently as well. But the real point is it's the start of a conversation, and which also includes terms. And so we'll look at that a little bit now. So when we start a conversation about ownership transition or expansion, we begin with a spreadsheet like this, a roadmap that shows the price per share, in this case, about 1.2 million, I'm sorry, 1,260 per share, and the pace at which the divesting is going to happen. So the current owner, who owned 100% in 23, is going to begin to divest to 75% over a 7-year period. And the new owner is going to begin to gain shares. By the 5th year, they're at 75-25. We show it as 7 years because the term for payment is 7 years long. So, this firm, valued at 1.2 million and having each share worth over $1,200, it's a pretty big lift, and it'd be pretty hard for someone to pay 25% of it, which is over $300,000 in the 5-year period. So the owners agreed to a term that is over a 7-year period. You'll also notice in this spreadsheet that the current owner is being paid from the firm, while the new owner is paying into the firm. So the payments for to the current owner from the firm are paying him off in 5 years, whereas the payments from the new owner to the firm is taking 7 years to pay. So you have, if the firm is the conduit in the middle, it's easier to set up a payment schedule that's pleasing to the owner, and a possible annual amount that is doable by the buyer. Now, the buyer's costs for the shares are being offset by their profit distributions. So as they gain shares, they also gain profit distributions from the firm. And in the first couple of years, they're in the red, and they'd actually have to put money in, a down payment, you might say, each year. 3rd year, they're close to break even. And then after that, the buyer begins to get ahead and actually get a little bit more in profit distributions than they're having to pay. And that being able to demonstrate that to a buyer, showing that there's some return on investment after a period of time, is really helpful. And these numbers will come from a pro forma. Part of this, and really part of the unknown equation as you're doing a ownership transition plan that's going out 5 years or 10 years, is needing to predict the firm performance out during those years. So looking back at the past years and maybe in the current year, they have some revenue goals and they know what their operating budget is, and they have a sense what it's going to be, and then you can predict forward from there. In this example, we show just a 5% growth each year, except for the first year, which is a little down from the year before. And we look at the average growth rate and profitability over the past years, and then try to set up a spreadsheet that a pro forma looking forward that is conservative relative to what the firm has done in the past years. And when we go through this ownership transition process, this pro forma is a real point of discussion, because often the incoming owners know a lot about, firm operations and what's coming down the pike in terms of pipeline, and, have a sense of how the firm is going to do in future years. So they contribute to designing this. But notice on this line that says payment to current owners, this is where those payments are listed, and they're actually deducted from the pre-tax profit before distributions are done. So the owners are the selling owners are more or less guaranteed that they get a payment every year before distributions are put out. So the amount of distributions that each owner will get are reduced by that amount, and often also reduced by kind of a savings or retained earnings that you want to also pull out before you say, okay, these are going to be our estimated distributions to owners, and the current owner gets 75% on year 5, and the new owner gets 25%, and as the percentages change over time. So the second part of this pro forma also demonstrates, what their base salary might be over time, what their total compensation is, which is adding their profit distribution and their salary to a total compensation, and then subtracted from that is the payments that the buyer is making. And so you can see this bottom line kind of cash flow pre-tax, and this is pre-tax compensation, because not really able to figure out the tax implications for everybody involved. Although understand that if you're a seller, you're going to be paying capital gains tax on the sale of your shares, for its difference between value now and value when you started the firm or acquired shares yourself. So what we want to demonstrate is that over these 7 years, the new owner is actually increasing their compensation, not decreasing it after they pay for the shares, so that they, can see that the future brings them, more possible compensation, not less, because they own the shares. And because that's kind of a hard sell, and so the price and the terms have to be constructed so that, there is a return on investment for the incoming owners, and, a reasonable price in terms for the selling owners. Once all of that is figured out, we prepare a memorandum of understanding. And the idea here is to have a narrative that describes the deal, that summarizes the intentions of each party. Often there's a non-compete or non-solicitation in there, something about intellectual property, sometimes an ND, non-disclosure clause. But this is not a legal document, because often it's prepared by a consultant. I prepare them. I'm not an attorney. And it says right up there on the top, it's not a legal document. What it is a blueprint for the actual legal buy-sell agreement to be prepared. So it's just saying the intentions of each person. And when the buyer signs it, all they're agreeing to is wanting to go ahead with the process, have the actual legal documents prepared. And the buy-sell agreement, of course, has to be consistent with an operating agreement, which often has to be rewritten if there's a single owner and bringing in other owners, because there are different clauses that have to be in there. So step by step about internal sale, identifying potential successors, nurturing leadership skills, a lot that'll be talked about in our second part 2 presentation. I do a lot of interviewing with potential successors. Do you understand the risks? Do you know that you might have to go without a paycheck for a couple of months? Do you know you might even have to put money into the firm? How are you feeling about the financial risk that you'd be taking on? We, discuss and determine what the right valuation is, set up the transfer roadmap and the pro forma, discuss leadership and governance, and finally draft this memorandum of understanding. So, questions?
If you have any questions, make sure you post them in the chat and I will read them to Rena.
Okay. It says there's 4 messages. Oh, yes, I see. No questions, though. Okay. Yes, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you'd like, email them to me. Let's also, it's been a while. If you want to take a 2-minute break or 3-minute break, why don't we come back at what is it, 12:20, and I'll start again, but just to give you a chance in the middle of our presentation here.
We did have one question pop up, Rena, if you want to
Okay.
answer that now.
Sure.
It says, why does percentage of ownership stop at 75% in year 5?
Okay, good question. That was just the deal. That's what the owner of this firm wanted to do, and I thought it was kind of a simple sample for you. But clearly there will be another 5 years. In this case, maybe the owner was a little bit younger, and it was really an expansion of ownership rather than a transition. But I sometimes do them, looking out 15 years, but it's really difficult to create a pro forma with any certainty when you're looking out that far. It becomes very formulaic, and there's just a little less certainty about it, and so often, even if we plan out 15 years, the first buy-sell agreement might be for just the first 5 years, because might want to reevaluate at that point. And I work with some firm owners who want that. We have a long plan for this person to eventually be the majority owner, but let's just do it for 5 years, reevaluate, see how we're doing. Maybe there'll be a second successor in 5 years. So I'm just, showing you a simple example, but they can certainly be complex with 3 or 4 new owners coming in at different times, and the plan lasting for a much longer period. Okay.
Another question just popped up. We are a PCS Corp and never issued all of the shares. In New York State, share owners can only be an architect, engineer, LA, etc. How does this impact sales? We have issues to date only 20% of shares.
Well, I'm not an attorney and I'm not familiar with New York law, but in most states, if you're a professional corporation, you can't have any owners who are not professionals. But there are other legal entities, business entities that would allow you to have owners who are not licensed professionals in your firm, like LLCs often do, or a regular C Corp or regular S Corp that's not a PC, might have different regulations in terms of who can be an owner. I think that there are some advantages probably to being a PC, which is possibly why your attorney, advised you to set your firm up in that way. Um, Personally, I'm not abreast to them, but it is restricted in that way.
And it looks like we have one more if you have time.
Sure.
In your examples, are the new buyers buy-in withheld from their bonus? Is there a recommended mechanism?
Um, Different firms do it in different ways. Sometimes the buy-sell agreement will say that any profit distributions awarded to the buyer have to be used to pay back the debt to the firm or to the seller, however it's structured. So that's sometimes part of buy-sell agreements. Not always though. So, in a way, you can think of it as if you're an owner, you get some profit share, but if you're buying shares, you have to pay the firm or the company. So how you do it is up to you. You might, maybe you have savings or inheritance or you mortgage your house or whatever. But and some people find that they want to pay off the promissory note early. So, that's almost always allowed. So because there usually is interest on these promissory notes. So if you pay it, at the beginning of the year, you avoid the interest. And that might be before you actually get your bonus or distribution. So there's a lot of different ways. And one of the advantages of having it, the buyer pay the firm and the firm pay the seller, is that there may be some years where the buyer, where the firm really didn't make much profit, and the buyer kind of needs a loan from the firm essentially. So the firm, if the firm has cash resources, it can sometimes carry the buyers who are the new owners, for a year or something if they need to. So there's that kind of flexibility too, right? That makes sense. Um, okay. Hopefully everybody's back. No more questions. Let's.
We have one more, but we can
Oh,
wait
one
till
more?
the last Q&A if
That,
you want
that's
to.
okay. We don't have to wait.
Okay. This one's from Ben. They say, I'm looking into buying into a firm, but I don't feel comfortable with the amount of debt that is carried from year to year and considered as an operating expense to get a good loan rate. Is this normal? Should I be scared?
I'm sorry, ask the question one more time.
So they say, I'm looking into buying into a firm, but I don't feel comfortable with the amount of debt that is carried from year to year and considered as an operating expense to get a good loan rate. Is this normal? Should I be scared?
Okay, it's the fact that you don't feel comfortable with the debt is, I think you have to look at it into it a little bit further. We're talking about a long-term debt? Is the debt at a low interest rate, like an SPV loan? Or, what is the nature of this debt? And also what's there are balance sheet ratios, like the current ratio, debt to equity ratio. Is the amount of debt unreasonable for the amount of equity that the firm has? So looking at those kinds of considerations, to, whether you should be scared or not. I do think, and it's also a matter of if there are reasonable assets, cash flow, has the debt been serviced, all these kinds of considerations, because debt isn't, necessarily bad. Debt can be, for example, a low interest loan from the Small Business Administration could be a real help to a firm that's expanding in whatever reason. And sometimes they're very low interest and it makes sense. So, yeah, I would advise looking into it and having perhaps an accountant help you interpret the balance sheet and kind of understand the financial health of the company. Okay. So book value, CE word two. Sneak up on me. I'm not prepared. Okay, so let's talk about some other options besides an internal sale. And acquisition comes up all the time. Would it make sense for my firm to be acquired? And by the way, that doesn't necessarily interrupt an internal transition process. You might bring on new owners, and together you could decide that it would make sense for all of you to be acquired by another firm. And one of the advantages particularly for owners who have only a few years until retirement is that if you're acquired by a bigger firm that's perhaps more financially healthy and you get shares as a part of your acquisition, or you get a retirement plan where you can actually get some golden parachute sort of payments as you retire for bringing in your firm. It can be a really good option, but you have to be willing to be somebody else's employee, which becomes a stopper for many of us. So here's a summary of the benefits of doing a external transition versus the benefits for internal transition. Generally, being acquired gives you a higher price. You might have access to doing projects you've never done before. You might have, access to a lot of possibilities that haven't been there for you in your smaller firm. So, and often it can be in a shorter time frame, and that can be very attractive to others as well. But there are challenges, and the biggest one, of course, is in matching cultures. And if you're acquired by another firm, how many of your current employees will stay? How many really would benefit and want this new opportunity, or would enjoy working in this other firm culture, because your culture does become completely absorbed, and you might become in it as a principal level, but you certainly, especially if you're retiring in a few years, you certainly won't have the same level of autonomy and control that you did as a firm owner. It can be hard on your clients. They sometimes won't want to follow you to a new, potentially larger organization. So there's some and sometimes when you merge, there's they want your firm because of your clients and your ability to do business development, and even put in incentives. You get this much more payment if you bring in this much more work, and that might not be something that you feel really comfortable with as part of this. Cash also becomes a real difficult part of the negotiation, particularly if you have a lot of cash in your firm. They want to buy that. They want that cash usually, but you may not want to give it to them. And because you possibly have already paid taxes on it, and it's really yours, not an asset of the firm. So having clarity about that with your accountant is really important before you enter into these negotiations. You might want to try to pull that cash out. So there's these various due diligence items that you'll want to understand as you enter into a potential acquisition. If you can get these kinds of things from the firm that wants to acquire you, it's a great idea. A lot of times they're not very forthcoming, which could be a red flag, but also, they aren't really required in the same way that you will be required to give these things to them. Um, and these are the kinds of terms that you want to make sure that you understand as you negotiate. And I really encourage you, if you're negotiating to be acquired by a larger firm, that you bring in a consultant or an attorney or an accountant, somebody, an advisor who can really, or maybe a group of all three, to advise you, to help you understand, to protect your interests and make sure that this is all really going to work for you and your team. So an alternative perhaps to acquisition, although sometimes, technically these are acquisitions as well, is to actually merge with another firm that's more a similar size of yours, or has been doing a similar kind of practice. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of case studies of mergers like this. In this case, sole proprietor who in his 60s, pretty good firm in New England, uh, grown and shrunk over the years, but no successor has been acquired and has been developed, and he's already thinking about retirement. So he started thinking about, finding a successor or a firm that he could merge with, somebody who, a firm that was run by somebody younger, who was doing the same kind of projects as him. And, these were the requirements, and it was really, kind of a unicorn thing. And we really didn't actually believe that would be able to find somebody. But in these kinds of cases, the best place to start is with people you know. And often the AAA is a really good network for that, but people you know, people you admire, people you trust. And there just so happened to be somebody like that in Chris's town, Sloan Mayer, who had her own one person sole proprietor residential firm, maybe not quite as young as would be ideal, but young enough, and a lot of local connections, grew up in the town, and was really interested perhaps in this opportunity of being part of a larger firm, because Chris also did commercial work and there was more diversity, a little more resilience. And so they started talking about it, and Sloan initially became an employee of Chris's firm, and eventually they came to a deal where Sloan became a 40% owner of the firm, and they rebranded to Mayor Kennedy, colloquially known as Make Architects, and have really grown their firm now to about 15 together, and are doing quite well as and Chris is really beginning to implement his retirement plan, working quite a bit less, spending half the time in Australia, and being a resource, but not necessarily being there for everyday operations. Another merger story, a little bit different, a little more complicated. K&B Architects had three founders that were all in their 60s, some in their late 60s, all approaching retirement. They have had a stellar practice, beautiful, serving the nonprofit community, had grown their firm to 10 to 12 people. They had really good revenue, not such great profits, but an existing very happy client base with strong local roots, and they thought perhaps there was going to be some interest in internal successors, but they were just not ready in their careers to commit to, actually taking on a firm. Um, so they started conversations with another firm, TNS Architects, which had two founders who were younger, but in mid-career, and had a smaller firm, but did similar kind of work and had, I think, a similar culture. And they had already decided that they were going to move into the same office, or TNS was going to move into the other firm's office because they had some extra space. So they started, working in the same space and collaborating on projects and talking a lot about how if they merged, they could facilitate the retirement of the KNB founders. So in the merger acquisition, and they had a very lengthy and somewhat difficult negotiation, even though they were very aligned in terms of their values and culture. Part of it was financial expectations of their time partners. They were like, well, we need at least this much. And they're like, that's too much for us to pay. And they finally, settled on a price that felt okay to both parties. The merger acquisition question was important, and oftentimes when you talk of a merger, it's a matter of creating a new business entity, and the other two business entities are either ended or fold into this, acquired by this new entity that is developed. In an acquisition like this, one of the firm's business entity ceases and the other firm takes over. And that's what actually is happening in this case. So the firm owned by the retiring partners is being sunsetted, and the firm owned by the younger partners is acquiring all of their assets and their employees. And it'll go forward, at least initially, with the name and the brand of the younger firm. However, they're engaging right now in a rebranding process that will capture the legacy of the KNB firm and really leverage their client base as a result. But they had to work out all of this. The cash assets of each firm was particularly difficult, because they needed enough cash to keep the merged or acquired firm going. They couldn't remove all the cash from both entities. So they finally made an agreement on that. The integration costs of integrating their firm, even though they were in the same space already, there's always cost in that. So these are the kinds of things that you would be discussing with anyone that you might consider merging/acquiring. So our third keyword, merger. Okay, back to this slide about ownership, governance, and leadership.
No.
Are there some questions? I could take a question now if there are any.
I'm not seeing any in the chat right now.
Okay. So we're going to move on to talk about governance. And this is this can be a kind of tricky topic, because when does somebody have a say in what's going on? Is it when they have 2%, 10%, immediately? All these kinds of things have to be thought about as you expand ownership. And generally, we use a tool somewhat like this, where we would think about the different kinds of decision making. In this case, this is an LLC, and they're talking about either consensus, and LLC shareholders are called members. So member consensus, which is not exactly unanimous agreement, but it's more like everybody agrees to go along. You know, there could be some dissent, but you keep talking about it until everybody agrees to go along with what the group wants. An ownership-based majority vote would be one vote for each share held, which means, of course, that the majority shareholders have more say in this kind of vote. And then there's a simple majority vote, which is one vote per person, which, you know, is a little more egalitarian, but sometimes doesn't make sense if one shareholder has 5% and another shareholder has 95%, right? And then there's the president of the LLC, which is typically the majority shareholder, majority member. And sometimes one of these columns might have executive committee or financial director or CFO, you know, so that there are sometimes singular decisions about some of these topics. Now, these topics are, you know, complex, big picture topics like changing the name of the company or dissolving it or modifying its purpose. Involuntary termination of an owner, that is usually spelled out. The process is usually spelled out in a buy-sell agreement, but or in a operating agreement, but you know, it's an interesting question that is often discussed a lot. Yeah, and why would you terminate an owner? And pretty much only if somebody goes crazy or something like that. But in that case, you have to have a process to allow that to happen. So we have, you know, 17, 20 of these kinds of decisions in a decision-making matrix that is important to consider as you expand ownership. And they can be very complex. Here's an example of one from a larger firm where there's, you know, one owner who has a super majority, and these different colors and letters are about D is for decision, R is for referral or check with them first, check with them second. It's a very complex and weighty decision-making matrix, but it shows a lot of thought. You know, how is this majority owner wanting to get input from the other shareholders? And it's a worthwhile exercise to think about as you expand leadership. Speaking of leadership, we're gonna, of course, focus on this with my colleague Sunju Kim, who'll be presenting part 2. But it's really important to understand that if you begin to elevate people who are perhaps at associate level or senior project management now to being owners or principals, they're going to be doing some of the things that the current owners are now, maybe retiring owners are now doing. So somebody else has to do what they're doing. And often what they're doing is being the senior project managers, you know, running a lot of the jobs, and you've got to begin to train people up, and you have to understand what that career ladder is in your firm. And knowing this and going and accompanying this with understandable job descriptions and competencies for each one of these circles, then, you know, people understand that people understand, you know, how they can get to the next level in their career, and that there's a place for them, you know, in leadership eventually if they continue to improve their capacities as professionals. We also work with firms a lot to do organizational design, which is applying our design thinking to how we want to work together. And often in a firm where there's several owners. We want to also understand what that leadership team looks like and who's doing what. So it's not uncommon that there might be a business management team that includes administrators and includes director level partner people, and then a broader leadership team that includes all the partners. So and then what they're doing and who they might be directing can also be part of these kinds of diagrams. And sometimes we do, organizational design charrettes, having the participants, the new owners, diagram for themselves how they're all going to work together, and it's quite a powerful process. Along with that, of course, we need titles and role definitions, understanding that titles and roles are two different things. So somebody could be an associate but have different roles within a firm. They could be a project manager, they could be a subject matter expert of some kind, so or a different discipline leader. So there's a lot of different. So sometimes people's project roles are really different or are expansive within one title. And understanding leadership roles. What does it mean to be a director? What does it mean to be a principal? And sometimes we forget to define, those roles, which are just as important as understanding what a project architect or a staff designer is. So we have a few more quizzes or surveys for you. Curious about those of you who are perhaps firm owners approaching retirement or thinking about expanding transition. If you use this code, you can come back in and vote on this. If this was more interactive, if we're in the room together, I'd be interested in knowing, what are your reasons for doing each of these, particularly being acquired or choosing the closer firm. So it's interesting to see how you all are leaning in this direction. Okay. Very nice. So for those of you who are not yet firm owners, but would like to be, how do you envision doing that? Maybe there aren't many of you here in that category, but let's see. Okay, interesting. Makes sense given the last slide. So I'm hoping that some of you are here. Some of you who want to acquire a firm internally are here with the owners who are selling it, and you can have a common nomenclature and learn together here. So just summarizing these key points, that leadership expansion enables ownership expansion, that training and identifying and paying attention to your emerging leaders is one of the keys to being able to successfully transition ownership in your firm, and that emotional intelligence, client management, things that need to be modeled. They need to watch you go to client meetings, go to business development meetings, help them really, spending 15 to 20% of your time mentoring and teaching and modeling entrepreneurial and leadership behaviors. So our final keyword, CE word, is organizational design. And I think that completes all four. And we have about 10 minutes left. Are there any additional questions? Please feel free to contact me if you want to talk, free business consultation, 30 minutes or so. I'd be happy to talk to you about your situation, or in ownership transition or any other issues that you might have. Other questions that have come up?
Yeah, we do have one. It asks, with the merger option, do both firms get tail insurance to cover the previous project liabilities?
My understanding, well, first of all, this is something you need to consult to your insurance agent with, of course. But my understanding is if it's an acquisition, the firm that is acquiring the acquiring firm's insurance will cover the firm that's being acquired. Now, there might be some additional fee involved in that, but it's likely not as much as tail end insurance. And my understanding is that in an acquisition scenario where the business entity of the firm that's being acquired goes away and the acquiring firm, gets everything, all of the assets of the firm that's being acquired, that it also takes on the liability of their insurance will take on the liability. Now, that's not absolute truth. There's different circumstances that will require different kinds of things to happen. So, you have to check your particular circumstance. I think it makes a difference whether the owner of the firm that's being acquired is continuing work in the firm that is acquiring. If that person is retiring immediately, I think there might be some different circumstances that come in there, but it's definitely something you have to check and get right in this process.
We just had another one pop up. It asks, at the top of the presentation, it was noted that many millennials and Gen Z architects left the profession during the Great Recession. How do you anticipate that might affect transitions 20 to 30 years from now?
No, actually, what I said was that, I'm sorry if I misspoke, but Gen X, it's a Gen X generation that was really impacted by the Great Recession. I think it may be older millennials as well. Gen Z was still fairly young when that happened. And but nevertheless, it is affecting our profession right now because 2010 is 2014. 24 people who would have graduated in 2010 would now have 14 years experience, 2008 maybe 16 years. So it's that group of people who would be senior project managers, associates, ready to take on firm ownership, that is really difficult to find, really rare right now in our profession. And if you're in that group, you're in a pretty good position to become, to get what you want, I guess I'd say. Other questions? And thank you for helping me clarify that. I misspoke. Yeah, so if you do have questions that come up, or if you want to talk about your situation, please feel free to connect with me. Our company does this kind of work for small to mid-sized firms. I think there was somebody here who's a firm over 50. in general, those firms have a pretty established process and maybe have both equity partners and non-equity partners, sometimes in firms like that. And it is important to consider how many partners will work for a firm. You know, sometimes I see one owner being replaced by 4 successors. And in a firm like that, you know, they definitely have to grow in order to continue to have the same financial picture that they would with just one owner to support 4. You know, there's a kind of common ratio of one principal to maybe 6 or 7 employees. And of course, you need more administrative support as the firm grows. So, you know, all those things become important considerations as you think of this. Do you want to grow your firm? Do your successors want to grow your firm? You know, what's the best option for you as for all of you as you consider the path forward? So with that, I'll finish up. Thanks so much for coming. And I think Cassidy, you're may stop sharing. I think you have some slides to finish up. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rena, for taking the time to present today, and thank you all for coming and joining us today. In the chat, I just posted the CE evaluation link. If you didn't catch all of those 4 CE words, you can scroll back in the chat. I posted them there. And then I'm going to share my screen very quickly as well. Just wanted to show you all some upcoming programs and events that we have going on. We still have 4 more sessions in this small firm symposium. The next one being Tuesday, April 9th, same time, 11:30 to 1 p.m. Eastern time. And then May 9th, we have an in-person conference called Reconnecting Communities. This is going to be a conference from 9 a.m. to 5:15 with an award celebration afterwards. So if you're interested in that, I have the QR code up on the screen. Go ahead and scan that if you want more information. And with that, I will let you go and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.